What is a grant? Well, a lot of people think it's just free money, but in reality, a grant is a commitment from somebody to actually fund your plan, your activities, and to help you do so without the need for repayments, and normally without any expectation for you to do any type of financial return. There are some types of grants that are modern and have a mixed model with loans, but we won't cover those today in any detail. So a grant is money that you don't have to give back normally. It is money from somebody who believes in what you're doing. It is a sign of their support of you, and it might be tied to conditions. Yeah, so you might need to return money, but you may have to meet certain conditions in order to get the grant and to be seen as having fulfilled your agreement with the funder, the person or the organization giving you such a grant, okay? We understand most grants are relevant to socially minded projects, but that doesn't mean it has to be a non-profit. Even social businesses, including community interest companies, which is a type of social enterprise, can apply for grants. Atern is, in fact, a community interest company, limited by guarantee, and we apply for grants all the time. So we are the living example that that works. You can also apply for grants if you are a charity, and sometimes you might even be able to get personal individual grants because of your background, your demographic characteristics. So there's some grants for female founders out there, sometimes some grants for creatives. So actually it doesn't always have to be tied to an organization. There are a few grants out there also for individuals who have their own projects, okay? But today we will mostly cover the grants that are relevant to organizations like nonprofits and social enterprises, okay? So if you have further questions, let us know in the chat. We'll come back to that in just a second. So I wanted to give you an example. Usman is a social enterprise in the Tern community, a social entrepreneur in the Tern community, and he has started Haven Coffee. So he employs refugees and trains refugees and asylum seekers as baristas. He then also creates awareness-making events, creative events such as comedy shows to raise interest in the talents of refugee comedians. And he has a social business model where he sells coffee. So there's a strong social component to what he does, yet also a commercial component to what Usman does. And yet Usman has been able to get grant funding. In fact, even before registering as a social enterprise, legally speaking, with a limited company with a strong social focus, he has been able to get different grants unlocked over time. He got some funding from Unlimited and also some funding from the Mayor's Fund in order to get his project started, as long as they were social projects, right? And so definitely those of you who have a social business model, which sells things to customers or delivers services that get paid for, can apply for grants too. But of course, there's also other types of projects, other types of organizations that might actually provide services that are free of charge to the end user, so the beneficiary or client, but that are not free to deliver because it takes time and it takes resources, right? Hence, I will give you another example. In UK, thank you for having told us your story before. That's why we recorded it, and I'll make your life a bit easier. You can lean back and check if you still agree with yourself a while later. I will now show you a recording about Yukai's experience in raising grant finance, and she has done so. Yukai, you have done so for Active Horizons, your organization, and your organization, of course, helps young people in Airidge Park in Southeast London to get access to opportunities, get training, and get a sense of community in the neighborhood. Fantastic organization. You collect donations, you deliver service contracts, but you have also raised grant finance or have been seeking grant finance for many years. And so we think you bring a great example. So Here's some more photos of Yukai's amazing activities, but let's just hear from Yukai right now.
Yes, so my name is
You can hear her.
Yukai. I'm also a refugee, just like
Yeah, it's good, Fred.
Thank you.
everybody else. It's nice to be in a comfort zone, I can say. Yeah, I set up Active Horizons in 2006 because I was a young refugee who was struggling with the system of getting papers, being destitute, and all those refugee problems that we face. And I found myself not having the right support and community because I was just by myself. My family was left in Zimbabwe. So I came to live in Bexley, which is a borough in Southeast London. If you know, Bexley is one of those white middle class areas. So you can imagine, you know, it was very difficult for me to find the right community. So that inspired me to set up Active Horizons, a safe space for young people, young refugee and migrants to come together and to be able to grow, but also to find opportunities to go into education, employment, and other things. I then finally constituted the organization and it was registered charity in 2010. Over the years, I was struggling both on a personal note, you know, trying to fight my legal issues, but also helping setting up the organization, which was a very difficult time because I didn't get any recognition in terms of getting funding, especially no recognition in terms of even statistics to evidence why we should exist. So that through that, I then did a report and a research looking at the needs of young people from the refugee community in Bexley. And the only way I could get recognized, I published my report in the local press. And that then changed the game. And I immediately started to get recognition and also started to get phone calls from the local authority, statutory services, because I let out things that was not really talked about. So yeah, that's how I came about. So Active Horizons uses three sort of like key elements, looking at youth leadership and advocacy, training young people in leadership so that they're able to challenge institutions and things that affect them, which include racism in schools particularly. We also promote arts and cultural and identity, and also mentoring. And of recent, we started supporting young entrepreneurs under the age of 17, because that's one of the key things that came out through our listening exercise from young people. So that's what I do day to day, and working with families, you know, and networking.
Thank you, Yukai. It's amazing to have.
Skip ahead a little bit. Just giving you another view of what Yukai has to say.
They picked you.
So the first question is, for what are you seeking funding, right? You can write that down on a piece of paper in front of you or on a document on your computer. For what do you need funding? Simple question. Can you answer that? Can you answer that on the chat? Like, feel free to post on the chat, whether it's a private note to myself or to everyone we hear amongst peers. What are you actually seeking funding for? Don't be general, be specific. It's about knowing something that is compact, measurable, and impactful, right? So something that is achievable within a certain time frame, maybe a short time frame, we'll come back to that. Something that is clear, that helps people, so there's going to be a clear impact, and something that you can measure the success of. Yeah, that's really important. Remember those three things. So impact, measurable, and a clear timeline. Okay, so for what do you need funding? You can write that down in the chat if you'd like. You can think about it or write it down on a piece of paper in front of you. The next part is how much money you need, because if you know what you're trying to do with money, then you need to know how much money you need, right? So some people think, oh yeah, roundabout, finger in the wind, okay, £10,000. Okay, but again, what for? You can come to the number by planning the what really clearly. It makes sense, right? I hope that makes sense. So you can write down one more thing on the piece of paper. How much money do you need? Or again, you can write this down in the chat, or you can write it down on a digital document. Okay, we'll come back to these later and even after this session when we work with you. Next, when do you actually need the funding? So when are you going to actually use the funding, and when would you like to deliver the project? Okay, so the question would be, do you need the funding in 3 months, in 2 months, in 6 months, or does it not matter? You will simply start when you get your first funding. It depends a little bit. If you started your organization already, it means that the actual use of the money could potentially be delayed until you have confirmation that the funding has been received. But if it's, sorry for the background noise, sorry, just a second. Just give me 1 second, guys. Just a moment, thank you. People have to work, which makes sense. Our cleaners are making sure our office doesn't go too crazy, so sorry for the background noise there for a second. In terms of the definition of when, it is a question of how urgent it is, right? But there's another side to the when, and that is, when is the funding available? And this is not just about the deadline for when to apply for the funding. Later we'll understand how long does it actually take to receive the funding, okay? Next up, who could fund you, right? Who can the funding come from? What are the organizations out there? Who are the people out there? Who are the funders? You need to be specific. You need to be finding people who can fulfill your what, your how much, and your when, right? So that narrows down a list of possible funders significantly, from everybody to just a few who actually match your objectives and your timeline, okay? I'll just quickly check the chat here for a second. Lucas, do we have questions that need answering here right in the live session, or can we keep going for later?
We can keep going for it.
Thank you. So forward, maybe I can help you with a hint. You might be looking for your first grant funding. Yeah, some of you might have received a grant before, but some of you not. So if you're new to this, you'll probably be funding your pilot, your first full version of what you do, right? Could be your first range of products being ready to sell. Could be your first service or training session for people being delivered, you know, and you could do it as a short project. So you could limit the time very clearly and say, I'm just going to try it once. Maybe that takes 1 day, maybe it takes 4 weeks, maybe it takes 6 weeks, maybe it takes 2 months. But that's like the definition of a short project, really a small pilot to see what you can do and bring in new evidence that what you are doing is impactful, right? So you would be able to measure your pilot if you can deliver it with the funding, if you get the funding. Another way of thinking about it is piloting the entire organization. You could say, I'm getting funding for 3 months to deliver projects for 3 months. I'm getting funding for 6 months, or I'm getting funding for 12 months. Yeah, so often you won't get pilot funding or your first funding for longer than a year. In fact, in most cases, you will just about be able to afford 3 to 6 months of operating against your targets with the funding that you receive in your first grant. I'll give you an example of what kind of amounts we're talking about in just a second, yeah, but maybe you can see the difference. A pilot project is very finite, very tied to objectives, and the pilot phase will probably contain multiple projects, multiple rounds of doing what you plan to do, whilst also building the organization. Okay, so the pilot phase, the pilot funding for the organization can also help you build things beyond your services, beyond your products. Okay, your funding can include your own salary, but you've got to be careful with that, because you are going to have to balance it out between other costs and your own salary, right? So you might not be able to get your dream salary with your first grant, but you might be able to contribute to your own living costs. Don't forget yourself and the cost of your own time when you make your first grant application, okay? Just quickly gonna check the chat. Yeah, it's great that you guys are writing down what kind of funding you need, and it's amazing that you're starting to write that here in the chat box. We'll come back to that. So let's not just talk for what, but let's talk how much. Now, these amounts might potentially disappoint some of you because I see some higher amounts as well on the chat, and that's cool. I'm just speaking here about the amounts that I have seen successfully fundraised for, on average, for first-time projects, okay? So for a short pilot project, like I said, a short project, not a whole phase of starting your organization, you might go for £2,000 to £5,000, because the whole point is it's short, it's measurable, and you can get evidence quickly. And the funder, if they see that you're successful with that small project, then they might give you more funding, okay? Now, if you want to fund your organization, not necessarily to run it full time, but to fund it for some part-time work on the organization. If you go for a 3 months period of funding, you might go for £3,000 to £5,000. If you go for 6 months, you might go for £5,000 to £10,000. And if you go for 12 months, you might go for £10,000 to £15,000, okay? Of course, it depends on what you do, how much of it you will do, and also how long you can afford to pilot, right? Before you have to pay yourself a full salary, okay? I saw some people saying here they need larger amounts of funding. Of course, that may well be the case. And there are projects that get a first grant that is larger than, say, the £15,000, which is the highest amount on this slide. For example, Turn, the first grant we ever got back in 2017 was around £16,000, and that was for roughly 6 months of work. So, you know, humble beginnings, but of course you can build on the success of small grants and build the trust and track record that eventually will give you access to larger grants, right? So it's all about evidence and all about experience. It's a bit like the CV of your organization when it comes to accessing funding. So that's a few amounts I think are quite realistic. Let's see a few things that all grants have in common. Normally, they focus on a clear target issue or target user. So it could be an environmental issue, but it couldn't be just saving the planet, but it could be rather restore the riverside in Nottingham Forest, okay? And specifically focused on the squirrel population, okay? So that would be an environmental grant that is really specific. There are some grants which say, oh, we will do environmental work of any kind, and we want to see your ideas, more open, but still as a thematic choice of environmental impact. Or you might say, well, I want to help people. Okay, that's nice. I want to help homeless people. Okay, homeless people where? And homeless people with what? Okay, now we're talking, we're getting more specific. So it's all about targetedness in the case of many foundations, because there's so many of them that some of them are not universal and available to any idea. They have their own goals, right? So we'll find out more about general grants that are a bit more open and specific grants as we go through the workshop. They are all impact and outcome oriented. Everybody wants to see evidence, okay? And that doesn't just mean getting the evidence at the end of your pilot phase or pilot project, but it means actually knowing what you're going to measure. So you need to define what success looks like before you start the project, and you need to even have that defined when you apply, because they will want to see that. That will determine your success with your application. Again, remember, no repayment in most cases because it's a grant. They will have specific deadlines in most cases. Not every grant has a specific deadline. Some are available on a rolling basis, or some are only available by invitation. So you need to know someone who knows someone, yeah, who can nominate you. But many, many foundations have grant cycles and grant application deadlines. We'll see more of that in just a bit too. So they open and close at different times of the year, sometimes just once, and sometimes several times, okay? So we will see a grant later that opens 4 times a year, but some grants open only once a year, for example, okay? And it requires patience and a lot of work, because grant writing and applications are laborsome. They are work intensive, not to warn you, but to make you aware it does take time. We'll come back later to how long it might take in detail. But remember, grant writing is not a quick thing. It's not a quick win, but it can be a big win. So, you know, patience and effort are required. Thank you for all the specific comments on the chat. By the way, I have also some private messages. I'll try to eventually get around to replying to you either during the session or after, okay? One more definition that I think is quite important is the difference between restricted grants and unrestricted grants, okay? So restricted grants are grants that are tied to a specific outcome and a very clear set of objectives. Most likely your first funding is going to be a restricted grant. That means targeted and with a clear pre-agreed objective and impact, so success criteria that you have to define. We will help 30 homeless people get off the streets within 3 months by doing X, Y, and Z. Yeah, that's specific and targeted. And again, as I say, it's common for first startup projects. It's tied to clear outcomes, potentially even to a clear process that you have to agree with the grant provider, but often it's mainly about clear outcomes. So you have to fulfill those outcomes to satisfy the funder. However, you may be able to get the money up front or half of the money up front and perhaps only half of the money when you have achieved your outcomes, okay? And unrestricted grants is open. It has looser objectives. Yes, you have a common mission and even broader objectives, but you choose how to spend it. Sounds nice, right? Well, it's common for more advanced organizations. Once you have track record, people trust you more to spend money freely and they want to give you that flexibility. So in year 6, Turn has more unrestricted funding than it used to have in year 1. Does that make sense? Because people trust us now. They've seen the evidence. Now they say, you know best. You know what? You know best. So you go for it. But we still get unrestricted and restricted grants in year 6 because some funders have very clear objectives and they're like, can you do this? We're like, yes, we can. But sometimes we get money that we get to spend on our operations, our digital setup, on our team, things that funders can't tie to a single objective, but they know it makes the organization stronger, better, increases our impact in indirect ways. Yeah. So you can also think of it as restricted equals direct and unrestricted is indirect. Yeah. Hopefully that makes sense. So you've heard about those. We'll come back to a nice little Q&A in 2 minutes. The last thing I'll show you about grants is this. Different types of grants you might be looking for. It's good to have these kinds of definitions and keywords in mind, because when you go on the internet to search for grants, they are important to understand what's out there, right? So let's talk about different types of funders or grants given by specific types of funders. The first one, social foundation grants. These are foundations that have a social purpose. They're not tied to a corporate or business. They are an organization just made to provide grant funding, okay, to social projects, whether social or environmental. They have a community focus or environmental focus. They already are very social impact focused. They have clear themes. So again, some might be interested in homelessness, some in children, health, etc. And mostly it's for nonprofits or for social enterprises with a very clear social objective and process, okay? And an example would be the National Lottery Community Fund, which gives lots of different ranges of funding, but you'll probably be interested in the 300 to 10,000 pound range. And they have a lot of different smaller grants that are thematic and tied to different objectives, okay? So they are great, and Lucas, if you don't mind posting on the chat with the link to Community Fund, that would be great. Secondly, we have innovation grants. Innovation grants are interesting for people who are doing something technological or innovative that is really challenging the status quo. So there needs to be an aspect of creating a new product or service that is very scalable, that can help a lot of people, and often it involves technology, okay? So an example would be Nesta, who fund innovation projects in e-learning, in the creative digital economy, in government innovation, in designing new societies, and in health technology, okay? So that could be relevant to some of you. Alex, for example, or Maggot, you might be interested in innovation grants. I see there may be a question from somebody, I don't know. If not, we'll come to the Q&A in just a second. in terms of the corporate foundations, you will find that these are the foundation arms of large corporations. Sometimes they're doing this through their corporate entity, and sometimes they also have a separate foundation. For example, Turn has gotten a grant from the eBay Foundation and has gotten a grant from eBay, the corporate itself. Okay, interesting, right? So they have a separate grant vehicle, and they also have a CSR arm, corporate social responsibility arm, still in the company itself. It's amazing if you can get funding from both. In most cases, they don't allow that, but we were lucky. We were actually allowed to get funding from both. Interesting, right? So corporate foundations are, for example, a toast company like Warburton's has a community foundation, or the Co-op, the supermarket, has a local community fund that is tied to their local stores, and where the local stores give a percentage of revenue to a chosen local nonprofit each year. You know, I mentioned eBay. There's lots and lots of companies with foundations nowadays, and so this is a very exciting option if your themes and your objectives match the objectives of these corporate funders. Yeah. Lucas has just shared a few links on the chat for you to explore that. And then there's government and local council grants, often really flexible. And sometimes here you can get grants for not just a traditional social business, but I talked about Usman earlier, and he has a coffee business, and he got a grant through the Mayor's Fund. So that would be one of the examples. The Mayor's Fund has a local recovery program after COVID, or had it after COVID. And Usman got some funding through that. And yet he was actually a bit more business than social, because he hadn't changed his limited company yet into becoming a social enterprise. Okay, so these are types of grants. There are potentially more than this, but we wanted to mention these. Now, finally, so Lucas and I have built a grant information database that you can find here on this page, and you can scan the QR code to bring it up and bookmark it, or you can open the link that Lucas is going to send in the chat just now. Thank you so much, Lucas. And there you can find always updated information that Turn puts together, in particular Lucas and myself, in order to learn more about grants and to actually find sources of information about grants. Okay. Thanks, Lucas, for sharing that. You haven't scanned
I couldn't access for this.
Okay. Okay, that's a good comment. Lucas, if you don't mind, just double checking the access permissions on the page overall, just to make sure it's open to
Good point. I was editing it the other day and I forgot to reshare. That's my fault.
Okay,
sorry.
okay.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks, Alex. Great comment. So Lucas will change the permissions shortly, and then you just need to reload the page that you've tried to open just now, and you will be able to access it without problem. Okay. That includes a list of funds that you might find really interesting. So Lucas has created another link specifically for this, which he will also post. It's just a smaller part of the wider page, and Lucas may have the same access permission situation for this, so he might be changing that as we speak. And this is something we're always going to update. So we will add to this, but we can't cover all your topics. You do like 100 different things, right? So you also need to learn how to find who, as in the funders that might be specific to you, okay? There's some very broad funds on this database, such as the National Lottery Community Fund, which funds a lot of different things, such as Unlimited, which has been successfully accessed by multiple Turn team members, community members. Lucas has actually brokered a relationship with them. So he has spoken to them and they now are aware of you guys, broadly speaking, and they're looking out for Turn entrepreneurs. Yeah. So you may want to apply to Unlimited. They actually open the grants 4 times a year. And they have 2 grants, and they've just updated the funding level. The entry-level ideas grant, Tony, this is relevant to you, £8,000, and the growth grant, £18,000. So they have 2 levels already, okay? But you want to apply for the right one. because you want to be selective. So Tony, go for the starter one. That doesn't mean you can't go for extra funding for the pilot, because you can piece together your pilot budget from multiple grants, okay? Which goes back to Margaret's comment. Thank you, Tony. So you'll find other grants in here as well. A tool which I love, which most people then don't end up using, which is a shame, is this awesome tool called Charity Free Funding Finder. Okay, I'll show you that briefly on the website of Funding Finder, and Lucas, kindly please share the registration page for this. So this funding database is free and is always updated by an awesome team. They're really nice for doing this free of charge. I'm going to just log in, but you will be able to register like I did and get your free account, right? And then you'll be able to log in. And you get to this database, which looks too complex at the beginning. So just click up here in the list. You see this Funding Finder at the top here? And they tell you to first watch the video, which makes sense, but I have done that already. And then I get to this view. I can narrow down by international or UK. That goes back to what you said, Margit. And I might say UK only. Region or country, you could go UK wide, or just say, for example, Scotland. Hey, Tony. And you could even narrow it down by a city, but that might start to get a bit too narrow. You can check what kind of issue. Could be animals, people with disabilities, it could be faith-related activities, food, homelessness, etc. Yeah, so you can see there's different topic areas that you can narrow down by. So, you know, let's say social enterprise for now. Sector and type, okay, you could narrow it down further by topics such as sport, technology, health, environment, education, and so forth. Let's go for environment for now. Let's go for the amount. Let's say up to £10,000, because we know we're just starting out. And you can say, oh, does it have to be added recently? Let's not tick this box. We want to see everything. And you can even type in specific keywords to complement your search. So finally, whenever you've configured it, you might get 0 results because you're being too specific, or you get hundreds of results if you're not being very specific. So you want to find results that go down to like 10 to 20 results, because that will be relevant to you. I hope that makes sense. Once you have configured it, you can press search. And this long list has now been narrowed down from 2,000 results to 21 results. Not too bad. So Tony, what's up here? Like we've got Scotland-based funds, or at least funds that are inclusive of projects in Scotland. So you can use this awesome tool to start narrowing down. And each of these entries has a short list of descriptions, locations they fund, and you can then find out either by clicking on the link or by Googling it. So now I found UK Community Foundations. Could be relevant to you, Tony, just an example. So this tool is awesome. And Lucas and I can never catch up to filter out all the results to put that in our database. So I must say, this is an awesome tool. If you learn how to use it, it's fantastic. It's just what I showed you, nothing more, really easy. And of course, you may not find that you're actually eligible for this. So I'm just going to show you briefly a little bit more about not just where to find funding, but also what's involved in the process. We have 5 minutes left, so that's what we're going to spend the last section. I'm sorry.
We've got 10 minutes now.
10
minutes.
10.
Yeah, minus 10 minutes.
Okay, it's been extended, meaning that you won't close the rooms until then. Okay, thanks. So we have 10 minutes, so there might be time for one more Q&A. Fantastic. Before we go into that, I don't want to miss out on something really awesome for you guys. That is Lucas's and my offering to you. Lucas, shall we show the general one?
We can show both, Fred. We can show both. It's fine.
Okay. So if you are a Turn community member who is not currently taking part in the Ideas into Action program, scan this link and find some time in January with Lucas or myself using the same link to discuss your fundraising strategy. Okay, this is our offer to you, speaking to you one-on-one. You'll see the first thing, somebody mentioned requirements. In fact, that is super important. Always check the requirements and the fine print first, because I often, Charlie, my co-founder, is sitting over there, and he's probably internally laughing if you can hear me, because there's been a lot of times, at least in past years, where I was like excited, oh my God, they want to do the what they are the who. And then I was like, amazing. And I shared a grant with him, was excited. And then he simply said, well, we're not eligible. So why did you, send me this and waste my time? No, he's not that. He's actually nice, but he might still be thinking that. So I have learned to check the eligibility requirements better myself before I get too excited. Nevertheless, never lose a good who if they like your what, even though the when is wrong. Often the eligibility has to do with how far you are, whether you're registered already or what type of registration you have, but there could be a way in later for you. So don't forget about them. If the what is right and the who is right, the when can come, okay? So check the requirements first before you apply, and don't forget, often there's a deadline and you don't want to race to the finish line ideally, so you want to give yourself time to prepare, and therefore you need to check the deadlines first, be clear on that from the beginning, so that unlike Kermit, you can do this with enough time, no need to panic. So an example, Tony, this one's for you, is unlimited, where you can apply 4 times a year. You can see the grant cycle here, once per quarter. They accept application on a rolling basis between January and March 31st. They get then assessed for 3 months. They take 3 months because they have hundreds of applicants. And then they make a decision by June 27th for that batch. And then they are actually going to give you the money only even a month or so later, I imagine, right? So it does take time. And then there's another batch which accepts applications till June 30th, another batch till September 30th, and another batch till December 31st. Okay, so that's how they do it at Unlimited. Tony, that might be interesting for you. It's just an example. Not all grants have that many application cycles per year. Some are one-off, some don't have a deadline, some are only per invitation. So you'll find the whole breadth of options, on the internet if you look closely. It takes time. It does take time. Typical application timelines for grants, in my opinion, take about this long. So you should manage your own expectations and plan ahead. Identify the grant, but then expect to prepare for 5 weeks, writing it calmly and ideally with some feedback. So I would say you want to have 2 months before you submit the application, and you might spend some time getting feedback from Turn, for example, or other peers that you trust to make the application better. Don't give yourself too short a time to review, because otherwise you can't give your best, right? And you do want to give your best because you want to increase your chances. They might interview you within 3 weeks of submission, roughly. It can take a bit longer. They might make a decision within 4 weeks, and they might then give you the grant 4 weeks later. If they're fast, oh God, that's 19 weeks or nearly 5 months, that's crazy, right? But yeah, it does take time. So you want to think ahead, plan ahead, and expect the realistic, and not be surprised by what you find. Okay, so manage your expectations with regards to grants. A few things to remember. Lucas, how long do we have? 2-3 minutes?
4 minutes.
4 minutes, thank you. Before you apply for grants, honestly, ask yourself generally, is it the best grant for you? And are you the best for the grant? So is it even realistic? If you were them considering their objectives, would you fund yourself at this stage? Be realistic, be honest to yourself, And if you don't know the answer to that, ask them. You can ask them before you apply, before you put all the work into applying. Often grant providers, not all, but some, have open office hours, webinars, and Q&As for people, or an email address where you can ask questions. So you'll ask questions to clarify, because otherwise you might waste a lot of time. And people who hear from you with questions, they think you're a thoughtful person and you're interested and you're putting the effort in. And so you might already be mentally earmarked without them wanting to have a bias. They might already think of you positively because of that, which is important because they are human, even if they're trying to be impartial, okay? So does your project really fit their priorities? Look at their objectives. Is your request for a suitable amount, Don't go for $100,000 grants if you can only go for realistically 20,000 or 10,000. They're never going to give it to you. You're not going to luck out. It's just not a question of luck. These are professional grant managers, so you need to be realistic. Find the grants that suit your development stage. Check if the timing works for you. Are you pressed for time? Do you really need to start your project in 2 months? Or can you work towards a start in 5 months? Yeah, it's a question, but also sometimes we have no choice, right? Because money doesn't fall from the sky or grow on trees. So we might have to accept the timelines and adjust accordingly. How big is the effort versus the reward? Is it worth the application? If it's £1,500, £800, I'm not saying it's nothing, but it might not be worth the effort. But above £3,000, okay. £5,000, okay, you're talking 10,000, okay, we're talking. So, don't necessarily apply for things that cost you more, even though you might not pay yourself a salary yet, than you will get in return, okay? And just always check, is there something more suitable? Did I double check? Is there not a more suitable funder where I can increase my chances? Also, don't forget, a lot of funders talk in different ways, but they're actually saying the same thing, and they're also asking the same questions in different ways. So double check whether you don't already have an answer written down somewhere to a question that just sounds different, but is actually the same. Yeah, people ask, they do different vocabulary, but in the end, often they mean the same thing. Don't rewrite every section every time when you apply for different grants, for multiple grants. Use a document where you keep all your best answer and you make them better every time you apply for a grant, so that you save time and you can focus on those questions that are unique to the grant you're applying for, okay? So just make sure to make it better every time. That's what Charlie and I do, and that's how years later we are better at getting grants now than we were 3 or 4 years ago, okay? If you already have a Turn business plan or your own business plan document or some other document where you have described what you do, please use that as a starting point. Take the copy from that and make it suitable, adjust it to answer questions in grant applications, right? But why reinvent the wheel? That's a good question, Yukai. We don't yet have a whole fundraising strategy document. We do have a social business plan though, so maybe Lucas, you could send that to Yukai. So before Lucas closes, we will just briefly cover one thing. In the sessions with Turn, we can help you, and also between sessions on a chat basis and such, we can help you with a few things with regards to grants. We can help you with identifying grants, but it doesn't mean you should just rely on us. Use the tools we showed you yourself, get to know them and use them to your advantage. We can help you define your grant ask, your what, right? And the success criteria of your projects so that the funders know what you're going to do. We can assist you with understanding the grant eligibility criteria. If you're not clear, am I eligible? Am I not? You can send us a message and we can check with you. We can help you review the grant application before you submit it. And we can help you prepare for your grant interviews, which is like a mini pitch or interview. All of that we can do, but what we don't do is write the grant for you, do the grant interview for you, give you the grant ourselves. Also, we don't have control over the grant criteria. So that's not our grant, that's their grant. So, we can only help you, but we don't decide for them. So we won't also decide if you get the grant. And also, if you ever needed to repay anything or report, we are not responsible for doing the reporting against the grant for you. We can review that with you, we can help you, but you need to do those things yourself. That's your responsibility, okay? So I'm sorry that we don't have more time for the Q&A. Lucas has to close the session now, but I hope this was helpful. Remember, hopefully you've booked your one-on-one. We thank you so much. Enjoy the second half of the World Cup final and wish you all a happy holiday and look forward to working with you in the new year. Thank you, Lucas. Also.